use public transport has worked jolly well. Um, and the same, I presume, is on buses. Certainly, the statistics seem to say about 15% use on buses. Car traffic is down by as much as 3/4, and certainly that's the experience that I get in London. So the campaigns to stop people travelling have been the most effective transport campaigns ever. Maybe there's a pointer there to the way that we have to reverse that. There are some amazing things about this, of course, which is, I'm struck. I work in my house in Islington, and in front of me, I look at the street all day long, and you see all these parents with children cycling behind them, kind of getting their daily exercise. I personally have done the naughty thing of taking my grandson out on a bike ride using the main roads. There's a whole new atmosphere in the neighborhood. I mean, people walk in the middle of the roads rather than just on the pavements. I think even though people are socially distancing, they're more friendly to each other. The air quality statistics are absolutely stunning, particularly in London and the big cities, but some countries across the world have experienced amazing improvements. Apparently you can see the Himalayas from 300-400 miles away when you didn't used to be able to see it from 30 miles away. I think there's obviously fewer people shopping by car, certainly in London. More people just using local shops. Obviously, some people getting deliveries. Working from home has become the norm. I must say I've had both sides of that. Some people say, oh, this is great, I'm really enjoying this. And I'll be interested to find out what people think about this. But certainly I've also heard the opposite, where people are just dying to get back into the office again. And one of the bizarre side effects is that one of Jeremy Corbyn's keynote policies, the nationalisation of the railways, has happened sort of by a backward route. And essentially, the revenue risk of all the railways has been taken in-house by the government, as it had to be, because otherwise all the companies would have gone bust. Similarly, there are similar bailouts with buses, although I must say that is much more complicated. Sorry about that, technical error. I dropped my mouse. I think that is a much more difficult issue, particularly outside London, where there's a mixed private-public kind of provision of buses. And it must be very difficult to work out what the appropriate subsidies are. And there's a lot of questions about whether local councils will actually ever get properly reimbursed for that. Aviation has all but stopped. Heathrow apparently had just 3% of normal passengers last month. And aviation, to which we can return actually, I mean, is one of the really most concerning aspects of transport. I mean, I do understand the reluctance of the government to give bailouts to companies that certainly are not British, and they have complex ownership structures. On the other hand, it's difficult to see how any companies can survive if a lockdown remains for several months. I must say the decision over HS2, I won't bang on about my personal views about HS2, but I do think that generally the decision about HS2 going ahead was very strange, and not least because the business model must have changed radically as a result of the reduction in passengers on the intercity routes. And I think there must be a lot of other more shovel-ready schemes that would generate the sort of Keynesian economic benefits that we're all familiar with, rather than HS2, which will not deliver a railway for 10 years. And in the meantime, we'll create some construction jobs, but there are a lot of other schemes that could be brought to fruit much quicker. So in that roundup, I mean, you could just see, as we all know, that this is I mean, the words fail me as a journalist and writer. The words fail me. Unprecedented doesn't kind of really fulfill it. It just is the most extraordinary situation. And you know, I keep on sitting down at home with my wife at the end of the day, thinking, you know, none of us thought that anything like this would happen in our lifetimes. I mean, it's almost one of the worst dystopian nightmares of, you know, a John Wyndham novel or whatever. So, how do we get out of this? Again, I've given quite a lot of thought to this, and there is no doubt that there won't suddenly be a day when we all go to the pub and all go to the restaurants and all go to the cinemas and all go to our beloved football teams, all play tennis, play cricket, whatever, all the things that I and lots of other people do on one day. It's obviously going to be a phased opening or reopening, and we have to kind of, I think, here help to put forward some solutions about what happens. We desperately need, as Keir Starmer's head and Boris admitted yesterday, we definitely need a plan. And as a speaker on Radio 4 this morning said, we need a schedule. And we need that for two reasons. We need a schedule because we need something to believe in, but we also need a schedule because we need to have a phased reintroduction of what was normal, and I'll return to that later. But I think there's no doubt that not all businesses will start at the same time. There might be a differentiate between types of business, between small businesses, large businesses, number of businesses, number of people they employ, whether they can socially distance. It was very interesting listening to the guy who runs Aston Martin today saying that they think they can produce cars more slowly, but they can still produce them with social distancing. I will address the problem about transport and social distancing in a minute. I think the schools must reopen relatively quickly, but I somewhat suspect that primary schools might reopen earlier than secondary schools, partly because they're smaller, partly because the parents tend to be younger and therefore less at risk, partly because they're a form of childcare, much more so than secondary schools, so they're preventing kind of parents from going to work and so on. So I suspect there might be a phased role there. Then we have the role of devolution. You know, what are the other countries doing now? Other than England, it's very interesting that to some extent what Nicola Sturgeon does one day, England does a couple of days later. And there's no doubt that she's pushing, I think, behind the scenes for faster action towards lockdown than maybe Boris Johnson would like. As an aside, I do see that, you know, we cannot continue. People are going to start rebelling, and I think that is you know, something that I think that is in the minds of the government all the time. So in terms of transport, what are the transport implications of this? My view is that they will allow more people called key workers, quote unquote, to travel. They'll allow more reasons to travel, you know, even for sort of semi-personal reasons, like going to go see your grandmother or whatever, or probably mother more than grandmother. So they might change the rules gradually in relation to that. No, there is an important factor here that people under 40 tend not to get this illness. And, you know, will that then mean that younger people will have more freedom than older people? I only ask that as a question. And as somebody over 70, I would resent enormously if they tried to stop me as a pretty fit 70-year-old not doing things that people in their 50s would be allowed to do. And several politicians, I saw David Blunkett kind of was warning against that sort of idea. But it might be something that comes about. In terms of social distancing, Peter Hendy has put forward the idea that you can socially distance on trains. And I've talked to people in the Department for Transport on this, and they are very doubtful. It might be possible with long distance trains whereby you only sell half or a quarter of all the seats. But even then, it will mean an end to the turn up and go railway, because it's all very well if you run from Leeds with a half full train and then you stop at Doncaster. Would you then allow people on at Doncaster? Probably not, if they were breaking the rules. And then the whole idea of a rail service goes out the window. I mean, if you then get told you have to wait an hour for the next train or whatever, railways as an option to travel are then impossible. When it comes to commuting trains, it is totally impossible. I mean, you just can't. I can't imagine that. One can't imagine how this could be made to work. Take a train from Guildford, the 819. I looked this up. There is an 819 from Guildford. And you look at that and you think, okay, say 100 people want to get on the train. How many do you allow through? But the train would have come through from Salisbury or Winchester or Portsmouth or wherever. How do you then know how many people are on the train already? How many do you let through? How do you social distance these people who are queuing to get on the train, where they'll all be kind of waiting at the ticket barrier or waiting on the platform or whatever? I just don't see the idea of social distances and railways as feasible. And the economics of it just are disastrous. Even if you have long distance trains and you only allow a quarter of the people on or half the people on, the whole business model absolutely falls apart. And railways will then be in a position where they need to be heavily subsidized all the time. Every route will need to be heavily subsidized. They will be under then great pressure, a year or two down the line when some of this is forgotten, to cut back services, to close lines, to close stations. I don't see that as a kind of feasible option. But alternatives are difficult, and I'll be interested to hear of what people think. In terms of aviation, I mean, we've already had Michael O'Leary saying, if they force him to run planes with the middle seat kind of empty, then he can't run them. It's not economic to have a 2/3, 66% capacity all the time. And for once, I agree with Michael O'Leary. I mean, it does seem kind of just not feasible as a business model. In any case, the air is recycled. Now the aviation companies say, well, the air is recycled, but it's very sophisticated, and we could take out any viruses out of the air and so on. Will people believe that? Will they actually agree to travel again and so on? So, whichever mode we're looking at, it seems that there are huge problems in the idea of social distancing and using them. Buses, again, if only a quarter of the people are allowed on buses, and you have to social distance on buses, then again, there'll be a lot of people left at the stops who can't get on the bus. They will not necessarily be social distancing. The whole model falls apart. And again, I don't have particular solutions, but I can just see that patched up ideas and half-baked ideas will not work. Okay, so to end my two potential scenarios, here's all the bad news to start with. Here's the kind of, the worst case scenario of what might happen. And I was struck by Auto Trader magazine, which kind of was actually, almost delighting at the idea that once this lockdown is over, people are going to all charge into their cars. They're going to buy many more cars, and indeed there are some signs already in China that car sales are not only just coming back to normal, but actually going up. So that's the kind of negative scenario, that people will be scared out of public transport and go into cars, that the government might actually want to stimulate this by providing tax incentives, certainly not increasing fuel tax duty, quite the opposite. Maybe companies might offer cheap car rental, that's been discussed already on the Bloomberg news site, or even offer loans for car purchase. The railways will economically be completely constrained by the fact that they will be forced to impose social distancing. Aviation will be very slow to recover because at the moment they won't, people just won't want to travel even if they're allowed to. And again, the economics of it are terrible. Similarly with buses, the economics just don't work, and we're going to need fantastic subsidies. The potential of cycling, which has definitely increased during this, will be ignored, and nobody will kind of be looking at this. Public transport capacity might then be reduced and start a spiral of decline. And the future funding of any investment in public transport or whatever will be compromised. But then there's the other side, and here's me being optimistic. But as I was saying, just as I got interrupted, if you remember, the ring of plastic in the City of London resulted from IRA bombs, and then they kind of started deterring people from going into the City of London. And indeed, the City of London is probably the most radical transport authority in the country, with commitments to reduce traffic throughout to 15 miles an hour, encourage cycling, walking, and whatever. So that's just to highlight that a good can come out of a bad. Just to look at a few ideas then of the policies that I think we have to implement. Cycle use increase must be maintained and built on. And there's ways of doing this through temporary or permanent cycle lanes, making the road safer, 20 mile an hour or even 15 mile an hour limits, temporary cycle lanes with cones and the like, and routes to schools, all sorts of kind of things. This is happening across the world, actually. I got a list: Berlin, Budapest, Mexico City, New York, Dublin, Philadelphia, Bogota, and so on. All cities and towns that have implemented these sort of methods. And one important factor here is that people who use bicycles tend to use public transport otherwise. And, we are going to have to recognize that in some senses we might need a slow return to public transport. But we need an increase in public transport capacity. In other words, if we're going to spread out more, we need more buses and trains. And of course, it's very difficult to get more trains quickly, but it is quite possible to get more buses operating more widely, and maybe people's rush hour will be staggered, so you have a longer rush hour where you have higher uses of buses. Towns and cities must think about car reduction policies like congestion charging, parking restrictions, road closures, filtering of residential areas. We know, those of us who work in transport for the last 20, 30 years know kind of all the solutions to this. Now, here's one. Petrol prices would need to increase. Remember, petrol prices will be at their lowest ever, a pound, less than £1 a litre in some places. It's an ideal time to put fuel tax duty on. I doubt whether this government would do so, not having done so for the last dozen years, but it's obviously something that should happen. There should be a shift in roads, away from the roads investment, the £27 billion programme that was set out and reinforced in the budget. Even Edmund King of the AA says, no, maybe that's not the priority kind of post-COVID. And we need a kind of new system of funding for both railways and buses, and that goes without saying. And then last, more people working from home. And here's a question: is more people working from home a good or a bad idea? In some senses, it's great, less imposition on the transport system. On the other hand, more social isolation, none of those water cooler moments and conversations and so on. So let me just finish on a bit of inspiration. Anne Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, said yesterday, and she's absolutely adamant that it's not going to be a return to normal. She says, "I say in all firmness that it is out of the question that we allow ourselves to be invaded by cars and by pollution. It will make the health crisis worse. Pollution is already in itself a health crisis and a danger, and pollution joined up with coronavirus is a particularly dangerous cocktail. Indeed, Hidalgo has specifically linked COVID-19 fatalities with air pollution, and that seems to be kind of accepted. So our ministers and local politicians must say no return to normal and recognize that transport and environment are intrinsically linked. And both central and local government have very important roles to play, but I think us, those of us working in transport, have a very key role in pointing the way forward. So going back to normal is not having air that kills people. Normal is not congestion that paralyzes our towns and cities. Normal is not a rail system that is creaking under pressure of use. Normal is not having a bus system that is chronically underfunded. Normal is not people being too scared to cycle or even walk. Normal is not school children having to be escorted to school. Normal has to look very different from last year. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you very much. Very thought-provoking and provocative, as I would expect, and I'm sure we all expected. We took in advance a number of questions, and what I thought is if I could pick a few of these that you haven't seen before, so it's going to be like sort of question time, and you haven't seen the questions across a range of issues. And in fact, the first one from Janet Greenwood quite neatly follows on from the end of your presentation there. So Janet says, I would like to ask Christian about the likely focus on the climate and biodiversity emergencies and the DfT's decarbonisation plans in the context of the post-COVID world.
Yes, I mean, look, we really have to use this moment. And, you know, I do worry we've got a Conservative government that has not really linked these issues at all. And I do think it's up to people working in transport, local politicians who have influence, to motivate the more sensible elements of the Tory party. And I think there are people within the Tory party who are thinking about this. There are also people who are just going to say business, return to normal, ignore the sustainability issues. And we really have to go down a different path. And, you know, I veer every day. I wake up thinking about this issue. But I think we have to be positive. We have to say, look, there is such an obviously link between sustainability and the environment, and the extent of mortality from COVID-19, and also a whole lot of other diseases. You know, we have to look at the end of the day, how many people haven't died because of the lockdown, and how many people's health has improved as a result. I mean, the emergency services are kind of saying, "Oh God, you know, why are not more people turning up in A&E?" And they see that as almost a negative, and I see to some extent that as a positive. So we just have to ram that message home, and it's up to each one of us to realise that this is a seminal moment. I think that people in 30, 40 years' time will, you know, if we haven't done anything out of this, will see this as a great lost opportunity.
And following on from that, Christian, Simon Whitney has asked a question about transport technology. So given the whole coronavirus concern and the climate change and the reduction in emissions that we've seen this year because of the virus, what do you see the future of how the future of transport lies in relation to hydrogen, battery-powered aviation, shipping, and bus fleets?
Yeah, so I'm not convinced that we'll ever get a battery-powered large aeroplane, nor am I convinced that we'll get a battery-powered large lorry. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't work towards more battery. Of course, as ever, it depends on the source of the electricity, and we know that. But we've just had the government change its policy about onshore wind power. Wind power is becoming incredibly cheaper. Now, here's a contradiction. I talked to Michael Liebrich the other day, who's a sort of conservative, but very pro sustainable energy solutions. And I said to him, isn't the big problem that oil prices are going to go down and therefore will stimulate the old technology? But he reckons that, on the contrary, that oil prices being so low will mean that there will be few attempts to kind of explore new fields of oil and whatever, or to open them up, and that in the medium term, if not in the short term, this will stimulate greater use of more sustainable forms of powering transport. So again, I think we have to be optimistic here, but we have to start this process now, right? We have to be talking about this now, which is why it's good to have this sort of seminar now. And I've already written 2 or 3 articles about this. But I think we all have to be talking about it while this pandemic is going on, and not kind of waiting for the end of it and saying, oh, hey, actually, we ought to implement some sensible policy. That's what's a bit disappointing, that, Anne Hidalgo in Paris and Milan and Rome and lots of other places, the mayors are really talking about very radical change. So I do think there should be pressure here, certainly on Sadiq and on Andy Burnham and other powerful local authority figures to be looking at all these issues now.
You mentioned the roads programme, Christian, in your presentation, and we've got a question from Neil Roth, who says that I understand that you, Christian, have always been opposed to the Silvertown Road tunnel scheme. Will there be even less of a case for it after the pandemic?
Well, indeed, given that all the evidence suggests that it will cause greater pollution. The problem with it is that it's a PFI scheme that is seen, I think, by Transport for London as free, because they think that it will be paid for out of the tolls. But one of the big problems here is, if there is a reduction in road traffic, the tolls won't be enough to cover the cost of the tunnel, and therefore the money will be coming out of the TfL budget. Look, I think this is so disappointing. I just think the idea that we can spend large amounts of money on improving roads in London is absolutely ludicrous. I mean, we stopped building roads in London about 30 years ago, when there was the Margaret Thatcher's last attempt with the road assessment studies. And since then, there's basically been no road building in London, and that's quite understandable. So to have our Labour mayor supporting a scheme that will undoubtedly lead to greater traffic, certainly in local areas, if not overall, is ludicrous. My view is, we should be tolling the Blackwall Tunnel at the moment, and then only the kind of more important traffic will use it.
As you would expect, we had quite a few questions about the railways, and I'm picking bits of questions here from Martin Horseman, from Paul Beckford, and from others. But Martin, in particular, was as somebody whose business is the new build and maintenance of rolling stock, was asking what you see happening in relation to the viability of the now loss-making franchises, and whether that could lead to the slowdown of rolling stock deliveries.
My view is that although the franchises have been effectively mothballed for 6 months, there's no doubt that we cannot return to a franchising system where the revenue risk is taken by the private sector for a very long time, because even if we don't have social distancing on the railways, or we only have a form of it, the number of people using the railways is going to be massively down on anything that went before. So therefore, the figures in the old franchises just won't work any longer, and those contracts are effectively dead. I think there ought to be much, by the way, there ought to be much greater transparency over exactly what the financial arrangements are now and what precisely is happening. But this coincides with the Williams report and recommendations in the Williams report, and I don't see how we're going to get away from the fact that we will have some new central railway body that will probably, certainly initially, and I somewhat suspect in the medium to long term, operate the franchises, liaise with Network Rail in some way. So it might actually be a joint organisation, or certainly an organisation that has very strong links between Network Rail and this new body. And we have to find a new model. And in terms of rolling stock, there's a lot of rolling stock coming through in the system already, new rolling stock. The cascading process is muddled and difficult, and we're actually at the moment scrapping some perfectly good vehicles that really should be used somewhere else, which is very sad. And I've always been of the view that, and I know this is not necessarily popular with the Roscoes, but I think you do need a central rolling stock strategy that again is determined by a government agency. So undoubtedly out of this, we are going to get a new government agency with certainly powers over franchising. My view is also it should have powers over the fares setting. Again, this is an opportunity. I mean, the fares have been, the complexity of the fares network has been paralyzed. Reform of it has been paralyzed because difficulties with the train operators who are worried that, whatever changes you make will result in lost revenue. Well, the revenue is all gone now. So it is a good time to actually rethink fares policy, particularly that, one example, season tickets, 5-day season tickets or 7-day season tickets sales are going down, and if people are going to work from home more, they will go down even further. So there's one kind of new type of ticket that's clearly is needed, is some sort of different types of carnet system or whatever. So overall, this new body has to look at fares, it has to look at rolling stock strategy, it has to look at franchising, and it will have to look at future investment, because maybe the future investment pattern might be different as a result of the changes brought about this. So a big agenda for whatever this new body is going to be.
I'm going to give everybody an alert that I'll open it up to a bit more of a free-for-all in a moment to respond to some of the things that you said. But if we could just stick with the pre-submitted questions for a couple more minutes. We have one on HS2 from William Whiting, who asks, in view of the fact that many people will have been working from home for a considerable period and will likely be continuing this way, what should happen with regard to flexible season tickets, and how might this affect the business case for HS2?
Yes, well, I just partly addressed that. I mean, there's no doubt that we're going to need a different ticketing system, as I said, and I think flexible season tickets must be high on that agenda. I mean, really urgently, because even if people are going to return to work, I think companies are going to use this as a way of saying, well, why do we have these large office blocks? Maybe we could have an office block with 25% fewer desks, and hot desking is going to become more the norm. People are going to work from home for 2 or 3 days and so on. They've now got the technology set up at home to do it, with the faster internet broadbands, with the software they've downloaded and so on. Definitely that will undoubtedly change. In terms of HS2, well, my views about HS2 are well known. I read the business case the other day. It is something of a shocking document, actually, that, at best, they could squeeze a benefit cost ratio out of it of 1.2. But with a reduction, they say with a 16% reduction in estimated numbers, which is not difficult to think we're going to get that, it goes down to 0.8. In other words, the benefits are outweighed by the costs, and that might even worsen as costs tend to go up. So the case for HS2 is really very poor indeed. It's quite extraordinary that the Treasury agreed to this. But they've signed the document, and I can't see them retreating on this now. The very fact that they gave the order to proceed during this pandemic, partly hiding the good stroke bad news, depending on your point of view, but also rushing it through in that way, does seem that there is real intent to get it done, and therefore I can't see them reversing their decision on it.
And the last ones from the pre-arranged, pre-submitted questions, a couple on a subject dear to your heart, Crossrail. So Ray Knight asked whether Crossrail might be the last major public transport project for the foreseeable future, and do we risk going back to patch and mend? And sorry, Christian, the other one was from Stephen Bacon, who's asked about running Crossrail trains on the existing network before it's complete to provide additional capacity, running sort of non-stop Reading Paddington services to deal with the social distancing problem.
Yes, I mean the latter's not a bad idea, provided that I mean the trains are there, as we all know, and they need using, because trains sitting inside is a bad idea. Whether they would manage to do that with, there are problems about the number of drivers who are available at the moment because of people socially isolating themselves or being ill. But that does seem kind of the sort of innovative idea that we need to be thinking about. And I think that's a wider point there, that we actually need to be thinking out the box here. I would like to hear people, politicians, just floating ideas, just say, well, does this work? Is this possible? How can we implement this? If we can build a hospital in 10 days, if we can nationalize all the railways overnight, one would think there is potential for a lot of imagination out there. Remember they built that station at Workington when there were floods within a few days. That sort of thinking needs to happen in the railways. They're inventing a vaccine. They said they seem to have invented a vaccine in 18 weeks instead of 8 years. I think in transport we need to be thinking of that, and that's obviously bike lanes is one of the ideas, but innovative uses of existing infrastructure on the railways is another. On Crossrail, sigh, because I need to write the second edition of my book here, and I'm really waiting for a firm opening date, because I'm dying to correct some of the over-optimism in my first edition of my book. And it's such a fascinating story. And look, Crossrail will be so wonderful that when it is open, people will be saying, why don't we have more of this? And I'm confident, Ray, that it will inspire railway investment and not kind of be the last big scheme. That Crossrail 2 will become more feasible once Crossrail 1 is open, because this is a world-class railway. It is beyond anything. People who haven't been down in the tunnels, haven't looked at the infrastructure close up, it is something that is completely different from, let alone the London Underground, but actually from any rail system I've been anywhere in the world, pretty much. This is such an amazing railway that people will be demanding more of it.
Thanks, Christian. Right, now, people have been messaging me in the little chat box, and there are also some raised hands. So I'm going to try and master the technology. And first of all, I'm going to unmute Rupert, if I can do that. Rupert, can you be heard?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. A comment, Christian, and then a question, if I may. The comment is, as you know, I work for Porterbrook. I don't think we would have an issue in principle with a rolling stock strategy. A long-term strategy makes common sense. A comment at the end of that would be, government procured rolling stock has not necessarily been a trial.
IEP, yes.
Thank you. And then the question would be devolution on the railways. And obviously Tom's on the call as well. So the Williams Review, in many ways, the question the Williams Review was set out to answer has been answered in terms of franchises at the moment. What about devolution, please?
Yes, well, here's an interesting thought, actually, which it might be that if the virus is less prevalent in certain areas, certain towns and cities, you might want the rail services to be stepped up in certain parts of the country and not other parts of the country. And that might well be influenced by the local authorities, who at the moment, of course, don't apart with the odd exception of Merseyrail, don't really have the power to do that. But it certainly begs a question. In terms of longer term thinking over devolution, I think there is a huge concern about this, which is, yes, people want kind of greater local control, and there is unequivocal that where there has been local control, rail services have improved more than where there hasn't been. And that's very clear. But, and it's a very big but, the financial situation here is of great concern. I mean, the real danger is that some sort of local authority bodies are given control over the railways, but not given the finance to operate either the services they would want to operate, or even to pay for the backlog that has arisen out of the crisis and so on. So the key to this, Rupert, is the financial arrangements. If there are good, solid financial arrangements to support the work of local authorities in financing rail, well and good. The danger is that they get past the responsibility without the money to make up the services that they want to provide.
Thank you, Rupert. Tom, yeah, I've unmuted you. Is there anything you'd like to say or can say about Williams?
Oh, lots. Very briefly, as we all know, the Williams Review was supposed to have been published at the end of last year. That was postponed because of the general election, and now it's postponed for however long this lockdown lasts. It's no secret that the Treasury raised some objections, and this has been reported, so it's not telling tales out of school, about some of the proposals that we were making. Christian mentioned fares reform, which is essential and is a big part of the report. But before coronavirus, the Treasury were worried about that shifting of the revenue risk from the train operating companies to the government. Now, whether or not, I agree with Christian. I think that the coronavirus, the massive reduction in patronage has changed those arguments somewhat. The one thing I would point out is this all these headlines and stories about the railways have been nationalised. No, they haven't, because they were never privatised. There are small parts of the railways that have got private involvement, and there are large parts of the railways that have always been, publicly owned and publicly operated, and that's not going to change. There will still be, even in the midst of the coronavirus, changing the revenue risk is rather different from what Christian described as Jeremy Corbyn's dream coming true. But he's right. I think this has changed the whole agenda in terms of whatever objections the Treasury had to fares reform, and I think that is absolutely vital. But having listened to Christian, I am deeply, deeply depressed and pessimistic about exactly how we get trains back on the rails after this is all over.
Thanks, Tom. Now, there was a question from Ian. I've unmuted you, Ian Lucas. And this one isn't about railways, about something else.
Yeah, I was interested in the debate within Wales, just talking about devolution, about the M4 Relief Road. And I speak as a former North Wales MP, and I'm not an expert on the M4 relief road, but it just seems to me that given Christian's exposition about the way that I think, and as a politician, I think it's going to be really difficult to resist people going back to cars. And I share Tom's concern about the future of rail, which I'm very strongly committed to and wanted to see expansion on. And I've been working on that for a long time in North Wales. But I think within Wales, there's going to be a new debate about the M4 in South Wales. And I think there are people in the debate who may know more about that. And also, how are we going to deal with the transport system? And I think about Wales as a very mixed place, very rural areas with some urban spots. Longer term, how are we going to stop people going back to cars?
Yes, I mean, this is my greatest concern. I mean, on the radio this morning, they said, 60% of people are going to be scared of using public transport. And I think this is somewhere where the providers of public transport need to use their imagination. I mean, we need, I think the wearing of masks will help, because I'm not sure they do that much good, but they give the perception that they do good. And if you tell everybody to wear masks, people will feel safer, even if they're not particularly, or even if they're unnecessary. So that might be something that will get. But I think we need publicity campaigns to ensure that people feel safe, that these issues are being thought about, and we need some imagination to encourage people back. I mean, you ask about the M4. Look, I think the M4 issue is dead. I don't think they're going to revive the M4. Certainly the government in Wales, I doubt it's going to revive that. But you are right. There's going to be a lot of pressure on people saying, well, people are no longer using public transport. We need to spend the money on roads. And that is all part of this wider agenda that I'm suggesting for all of us, which is that we absolutely have to be putting forward new and radical ideas the whole time, and emphasizing that, the overuse of cars was one of the reasons why lots of people died. And there's no doubt about that. We actually have to say that. We have to say cars kill. For a long time, there's been this idea, there's a certain amount of excess deaths as a result of air pollution in towns and cities. Now we can say, my granny died because she lived in a polluted area and got coronavirus, and that has to be made real.
Thank you very much, Christian. And sadly, ladies and gentlemen, our time is up. So I wondered if you would all like to unmute yourselves and give our guest speaker a round of applause. And failing that, we can he can see the hands moving. So
thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christian. That was as thought-provoking as I'm sure we all hoped and expected it would be. And we're at the start of a very important debate and series of actions to address the challenges that you have raised. Thank you to everybody for taking part. Thank you especially to Kimberly for coming up with the idea and doing all the logistics. And do visit Transport Info, our free news aggregation website for the transport industries, and do follow us on social media. So I wish you all safety and good health. Take care, and thank you very much for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you for all coming. Thank you.